Hello, everybody. Welcome to this second half of the week's appointment of Masterclass. YouTube Masterclass is what makes it all happen. We teach a college course through Coursera, one per semester, one in summer school. You can get credits in a class. You can get 16 credits. It's 16 classes. You get 4 units for taking the class, either at USC, California Institute of the Arts, or Harvard. And they each have the similar program. You can get the similar venue from Coursera, who I work for, and they work for me. We will have a final. We have 6 classes left. I don't want to give away too much at the very end of this, but as we've talked about, the subject matter being something that's kind of touch and go, but it's also we're kind of leery to grab onto the material because it seems dated, or it seems like candor from another era, or like, do we sit around and just judge movies for their race, class, and gender? Is that all we can do now, or can we expect to see some like humility, at least in the range of the ability to connect shots together, to technique of shots, and we call them shots, but they're edits. They're the whole composition of cinema, rolling between one frame to the next that isn't moving, isn't part of the shot unless it's a freeze frame, because you can't have a shot that's a freeze frame, but it's always, the shot's always moving forward. That's one thing we don't discuss enough in film, is that everything's moving forward to the end anyway, from the beginning to end. Even this masterclass video, it's started a little bit ago and it's gonna keep going, and then it'll eventually reach the end of the class in like almost an hour, and you can kind of see how these like modicum of time filters in a movie or shots are actually filling us with the vessel that we need to receive from these large screens the images that together tell a story, and that together have a pattern in a story. And looking up some of those Turner Classic Movies dates really threw me, and it threw me as a teacher, and I thought, well, I wasn't prepared to have the wrong dates on Sally of the Sawdust, for instance, and I'm still apologetic about not having that, because really Sally of the Sawdust was a whole different movie if you consider that it's not until 1925 that it comes out, and that was W.C. Fields in a D.W.Griffith movie, not 1918, where again the war is just ending, the votes just coming in for women, and Within Our Gates is coming out, as along with Broken Blossoms, and Sally of the Sawdust ends up being later in the silent era, when there's almost sound. One thing you got to realize, of course, and you'll find it in this book, and you'll find this book to be kind of a Bible for this class, and it's the D.W. Griffith An American Life. It's by Richard Schickel. He also wrote for Time magazine, and this is I've had this book for years, and first when I went to film school, I bought it, and I read it, and it's got everything in it that I've been telling you about his life, when he was young and he was near vaudeville, and then he was in Tin Pan Alley, and then he was a stuntman in Thomas Edisonville, whatever they called that in New York, and then, because Thomas Edison had a studio. It was kind of nice. It was a Black Maria, and it was this whole movable studio. You kind of see how he was a light to the connected point expert, Thomas Edison, even in his only film, The Uninvited. This doesn't talk much about the Edison days except towards the beginning, and it doesn't actually make the case that they were ludicrously enemies, that Hollywood started to just gang away from Thomas Edison. At some point, they still kind of had to hand in their hat as filmmakers, and whatever driving force film history has, a lot of it is because of them. And whether or not they had a bout or not, it's kind of publicity. It's like to say D.W. Griffith schismed from the church of Thomas Edison and bore out his Hollywood fame only to be blustered by a series of racial stereotypes in his first movie that he wasn't ready for, and now he's going to pay the penalty by being this outre director for the rest of his career, as he always was, but he's making mostly melodramas. So now we see real life in an image painted before us, the romantic melodrama, and what that does is it heightens time and space so that you can do these longer takes of soft focus and really eliminate any kind of trouble you have with the lighting and sound to make this look like the most romantic deluge of Hollywood. And that's what they wanted in the beginning. was that idea that everything was going to come together. The star will rise, Lily and Gishla rises as a star, and that there's mythology for how the studios will rise, and the studios all start rising in the silent era, already picking up their genre spot. Fox, even known for westerns. I mean, it's getting crazy in the silent era. The super westerns, these big agendas, the covered wagon. And all these films out are at the same time, and you got to realize that Griffith is only one player in this whole hegemony of like kind of an arrest of like, or it's like all these different fields that are playing. And some of them Griffith put an open window for, and some of them didn't know much about Griffith, and some of them came to know Griffith later, because really in the early days, he was kind of the baron that oversaw, in some ways, all cinema that was being made around the time of his rise in Birth of a Nation style. He was already looking at all the other films that were out there and seeing how they would be interpreted and how they'd be made. His prestige got a little less after Birth of a Nation, because people in Hollywood were much more liberal. They were like, we don't mind if African Americans are free. We like African Americans to be free. In this sort of modern age, like there wasn't as much racism on the streets as what Griffith was seemingly plugging about the Civil War, which was mistaken as talking about then, as not then during the Civil War then, which is a different then than now, being then during the Civil War, or then during what they believed was the Civil War. I mean, it takes a different time frame to even reference the point of which we've seen it, based on when it was released, based on what it was about, and how much it was supposed to relate to society. And I know a lot of films relate to society, but with Griffith making so many period pieces, there has to be an edge to say, well, maybe he was making it about a time that no longer exists. I mean, that's kind of what the film like blends in at the beginning to say about Birth of a Nation. So now we're already symbolically saying he's waving the hazard flag, and he's saying, I'm siding with the South, everyone. Come along with me if you wish. It's a devastating, disastrous journey. Here we go. And we're at the beginning of Birth of a Nation, and you're just like, with everything's like holy with the shots, like the shots are down low too, up on the sides, and drilling in on these like pan shots that are dolly shots too, and they're all moving forward, and you're getting this kind of like grouty edge around all the film, which is kind of like this ellipsis of how the not the horizontal and the vertical, but in fact this very oval shape is around all the images, and it's going to process the way the images relate to each other within the oval shapes that fade in and out as an elliptical cut, and then to the shot of the words of the intertitles that come during the midst of the talking, usually timed out to come right during the middle. They're timed out, those intertitles, by the director even back in the silent era. Those are very difficult to time out because they're not always exactly halfway through, but they're a halfway point for everything once there is a point, right? I'm just getting there. So with this D.W.Griffith book in hand, I have to take you through an American life that I want to just say that there was no hope for Griffith after The Struggle, the movie The Struggle. And I think it's weird that isn't Adolf Hitler's book called The Struggle or My Struggle? And then there's totally different frame of mind thinking. Guy that fought with Hitler was Griffith, and his last movie is The Struggle. But he's talking in Griffith's, it's kind of puny because he's talking about alcohol, and it's like, oh, we struggle with alcohol so much. And a lot of references are, I know, stay away from that point because it seems to be medical in the cases that are too extreme to continue to use alcohol when there should be a limit to everybody's daily diet. I don't know. I don't know what the deal is with alcohol. I'm not real sure what it takes to even procure alcohol and sell it and be accommodated with the upheavalings of alcohol. I really can't answer that question. In an earlier time, in my 20s, I may have been able to answer that question. My friends could all tell you I could. But now I don't really know. It's like I saw The Struggle and I went off the alcohol too, just randomly. I was like, well, I don't need it anymore. No, I'm kidding. Actually, then there's the other side of the coin, which is the prohibition coin, which is, do we have everything get ruined because of prohibition, because that'll bring in fake alcohol, and fake alcohol causes lots of deaths. And so we're like, we don't really want the prohibition, so we don't like the struggle. We don't like reefer madness later telling us that weed is evil. But the gut reaction is a laugh that that the government would even be telling you that weed's illegal. It used to make Griffith grimace. And then he'd look back and say, well, the struggle wasn't about the government. It was about one man who was stuck on alcohol and we wanted to make the sights and sounds of it. It's like a Lost Weekend, Fear and Loathing type thing. And that he went down with the ship on it is perfect, because Abraham Lincoln was the one right before that in sound, and that one was going down with the ship already. And if I couldn't tell it any better, by the end of the struggle, they're saying prohibition anyway, but Mark Griffith, a complete communist, and sending him to prison. He can't make movies no more. His prisoner license is up. He's too much of a commie. And Griffith didn't really drag too much of his Communist Manifesto into films. We're not sure when it was that he became a communist. Was it on the set of Intolerance? Like some people say, he acquired Buddha while watching Intolerance and making it. But then we don't think it's Birth of a Nation, because if you acquire Buddha, then you're not really supposed to espouse racism necessarily, although we keep getting on this word racism. Like Birth of a Nation equals racism. Like there is only one film that we always have to make sure we bring up the word racist with, and that's Birth of a Nation. Oh, it's Birth of a Nation, it's racist. If no one's seen it, you kind of see why that's brought up, because then they're going to have to watch it for themselves and say, okay, well, this isn't really that bad, or this is really horrible. And I switch back and forth every day. I'm like, that wasn't that bad. I look at a scene independent of the rest of the film. I kind of lift it up, and we can look at the film even on the internet and just be like, that is a powerful, powerful trip. And there's that 4K version. I looked at a little bit of that. That's gorgeous what they do in the 4K version. No, it's simply beautiful. And I can't argue that, like, it's a subject to study. I mean, I thought it was interesting. Speaking of subjects to study, and I might have brought this up in this class, but I thought it was interesting that our former President Obama, as the head librarian to the Board of Education, which is very nice of him to keep working at a time when it's so hard to keep a job and be, of a lower division, and that he was in there as the highest division of the librarians, and he said they need to bring back Mark Twain and bring back all the books that they keep incinerating because of their racist ploys. It's like, they're just racist ploys. We're not mad anymore. It's been too long. Bury the hatchet. Let's have the books back. And then you get like liberal white critics like me that are kind of conservative too. And I'm like, well, I think if it offends people in Mark Twain, they should erase the word or not sell it to children. Let's not sell it to children if that word's in it. And the whole thing's a kid's book. I mean, it gets really redundantly ridiculous about how dated anything looks that still makes a mime to a culture that is obviously something we can't quite understand, even though we're limited with reading material about what it is. And I mean, what's great is this goes through it all. I mean, this has like the whole legend of D.W.Griffith from the time he was born in the South to when he hit the road and became a filmmaker at Biograph. And Biograph was Thomas Edison's studio, and when he became a student there, that's when he realized he didn't want the films to go away. Like, he didn't want the films to disappear or rot or blow up or anything like a Tin Pan Alley. At Biograph, and he finally was able to talk Edison into some of it. It wasn't biodegradable film anymore. It was now film that they saved, that they looked at, that they thought was to be the new medium if it ever caught on. And in this era from 1895 until 1915, Birth of a Nation being the deadline of when all films need to be caught up. And really, that deadline we discussed makes no sense. Because first of all, you have this film over here, even on my shelf, called Inferno. It's not Dante's Inferno. It might be Dante's Inferno because it has a Dante reference in it a couple of times. But the Inferno, the Italian Giuseppe, I can't think of his name, like Giuseppe Martinelli or something. He directed Giuseppe Ruggiero directed a third of Inferno, and he's about the notes you can get from the film. And he was the head director, and it looked like they used him in a lot of ploys to make things look really hard to do and fantastic, and fantasy worlds and art paintings that they wanted to copy, like Hieronymus Bosch, or just these instruments of angels and demons and dragons flying everywhere. And plus, it's a movie that we can consider a full-length feature. Now, the animated film, which is made in some similar ways to the films that are made like the live-action narrative genre that was produced by Griffith and then kind of got picked up by John Ford and kind of got moved on by Hitchcock and kind of into Kubrick, and then you'd have like Spielberg and Scorsese, and that's where we're at now. And they're still making the films now, and we sort of have this, it all goes back to Griffith, even though Griffith goes back to Porter, and Porter goes back to those horse race bets with the governor, who said that all 4 horse feet would be off the ground at the same time when they were trotting and running, and pictures would prove it because they'd take multiple pictures in a row, which together looked like a moving picture. And they must have noticed that enough to make a processor to make to shoot the projector, to shoot and throw an image onto a screen. And these are all very delicate processes. One thing we can give to Thomas Edison is at least he organized it all before it all went to Hollywood, because he organized it the way in which the money was to be made with the banks, along with how cinema would be a capitalist enterprise, but that sometimes entertainment would take something that Thomas Edison didn't have, and that was education in the arts. Because we all know that cinema, to move towards an angle other than science, would be the arts. It would be definitely an entertainment bonanza that Griffith was born during this whole time of seeing the cinema raise around him and becoming this kind of bonanza of dealing, and then was kind of calling to him to come be even stuntman at an early age for the biograph pictures of Thomas Edison, and that he really was in a lot of Thomas Edison movies and helped him. And we went over Thomas Edison in another class. I wish we could go over it again. I wish we could look at the Thomas Edison and see what he did wrong and see what he did right again. Somebody find that disc for me. No, it's in the wake of discs over here that I've been trying to compare and contrast with Birth of a Nation, and I don't see much comparison except in those sort of big, long films like Heaven's Gate is another one that's a lot like Birth of a Nation in many ways, and I'll tell you why. Because it was over budgeted. That means they spent more money than they had. And it was under budgeted in some ways towards the reckless acting and the food they needed to keep the show going. Birth of a Nation was a doomed film because of the subject matter, and Heaven's Gate was a doomed film because of the subject matter. Heaven's Gate, there was like years later some like weird outer space alien cult that was drink the Kool-Aid about it, so Heaven's Gate's got an extra one going on it, but hopefully no one remembers that and remembers the good movie, because Chris Christopherson, big star, Lillian Gish, big star. It's all going forward, and then like Birth of a Nation, wrecked earlier chance for the studio system to get going on its own. The Heaven's Gate, when it bombed, it took out United Artists for a few years. In fact, me and a few other artists just brought back the United Artists break slip logo. And you can do your films under a United Artists, just telling other filmmakers, and that they have a Criterion United Artists related logo, which is if your film is for Criterion. If you need to get some help with your film getting Criterion, come to me, because I can usually launch a pretty good Criterion sort, unless it's one of those sorts of films that's already so abundant in its own sales of its own marketing, its own franchise. We usually don't take, because this way we can reissue the rarer films and have them find a place on the internet with better technology and so forth. So now that we've given that Criterion a little sampling, now you see why in my in my reverence for film, I'm always holding up these Criterion versions. But no, we're working on a mystery, and that is the mystery of why it was that the eccentricities of D.W.Griffith were like mimicked and like made fun of. And in the 70s, it kind of got to be a time where it was really reactionary, and the Griffith style was completely demolished by filmmakers. Not so much like Steven Spielberg, but some filmmakers went out of their way to demolish the D.W. Griffith classical style, to throw it all out on its horns, to say that it was as bad as the films were, that none of the silent films of that era made any sense, and his the least. And there was kind of this grab for that, and it went away with Andrew Series in the 80s. He's like, no, we've got Sunrise, we've got Nosferatu, hang on. Because you don't want to lose the silent era. You lose like a third of all of cinema's most perplexities that are available on DVD or Blu-ray or whatever other medium you're crossing me with your silent films. But you can also look at them on your computer, and there's hundreds on YouTube's that you can just go through and like surf them and save them if they look cool, and show them to your friends because they're rare. And if they're silent at all, that means they are rare, and they didn't just make them. And they may look like they're pretty good prints because they've remastered a lot of them digitally, and I'm not against that. I think digital remaster is one that you can fly over the coop with, and I think it's great. And that, would there have been an apparatus and machinery without Griffith? Sure, but it would have looked different. It wouldn't have looked so frontierish. It wouldn't have looked so Calvinistic. And it wouldn't have looked so Enlightenment, right? Because we've got the Old West frontier, we've got the Calvinist like experience of religiousness here in everyone. And we've got the frontier, and the Enlightenment is coming on just from the medium of cinema being able to tell a story. Now that it's telling a story of a while back in the past is why we're all getting into trouble saying, so was it the stereotypes in 1915 about the stereotypes of the Civil War, which no one really knows when that was. According to the film, it was like 1846 was when it all started. You're thinking that's a 50-year war. I don't even think they got into the war for that long. It was only like 3 or 4 years, right? And then you get these sanguine romances that the World War I's going on at the same time that Griffith is about to go enlist in the war and cut down on his making of films already to go to World War One. I mean, they can't. Griffith's just now getting his big breaks all over the big cinema, and now he's going to World War One. And I'm thinking, okay, so he wants to be a soldier, and now he wants to make movies about World War One. Well, guess what gets him in trouble in World War Two? Making movies about World War Two, because now the war is so vicious that everyone's been ghastly killed, and everyone's killed everywhere. And Griffith wants to make these war movies, and now he's all got PTSD, and all his war movies are locked into a vault among the war people that run war, and the sergeants and captains of the U.S. government all have access to those films, but we as patrons don't have to go out and see what Griffith shot of the horrible war that was in his head, that when he went back to jail for being a communist, mind you, he only got off for a good time for World War II, and only because he fought in World War I did he get to go to World War II, and it's a great experience being him and then being locked in a cage. And what's weird is about Griffith being locked in a cell for being communist after the struggle, and then after World War II, is that most of the time they were putting actors and screenwriters into prison with him, saying that this is what happens to communists, and most of them ignored or didn't really care that it was D.W. Griffith who was sacked in there for the longest, and he was actually the one. Excuse me. He was the one that most put up for the cause. And I think that he most put up for the cause of being a communist filmmaker was already totally ironic, considering most of the ones that got in there were then later denying they had been communists just to get out of the whole blacklist that was put forth to them in strange measures like the House on Un-American Activities Committee, which should have never been in there, but was devised after Griffith had already gone for communism in jail, or is in jail. I mean, it wasn't like the prisonliest environments, but it wasn't like we were living on like a good concern with, safety here. It's like now we're in jail, now I gotta be like, and I don't know anything about why they left him there because he had no answer for his communism, or why, when the other actors didn't get out, or when the House of Un-American Activities Committee was almost thoroughly vanquished, he was still sitting it out at commie jail after World War II for 3 more years, and then he went to his house, chilled out at his house for a while, thought he was still making Birth of the Nation, saw Lillian Gish one last time. But now, in the World War I days, and even after that, the jazz era, there was an important figure, Louis Armstrong, that figures into Griffith's American life that is a little bit talked about by Schickel, but also goes into the African American spirit of things, like where was the African American cinema during all this time, and why was the dominating picture, Birth of a Nation, not even making enough money to retrieve its box office, even though it was just banned by the NAACP as being racist when it was released. Well, and then for Griffith to gravitate toward the black community was not just because he was already hotbed full of blacklist, but he needed a friend named Louis Armstrong so he could listen to good jazz music. And really, the only thing that calmed down Griffith at that period was listening to jazz music. And I know that seems like a racist, like make me your slave of jazz, type thing. But it wasn't like that. It was like Griffith really tried to buy him pot. What? Come on now, he tried to keep him pot informed and everything when it was illegal too. I mean, come on, there's a little bit there. Friendship, you have to friend someone, trust them. But the main thing is he flew with them in a pilot wings in the World War I and World War II. And they were buddies, and Louis Armstrong and Griffith were actually on the aisle to make the movie The Jazz Singer, the original, with the blackface being the but then they changed it to The Jewish Idea, and Griffith likes the Jewish idea and decides to back out, and he didn't have enough money to get the films all sound film, and they could have made a black and white jazz singer, and some of Louis Armstrong's voice is actually maybe in the jazz singer. And I read the production notes for the jazz singer, and they're so small and hard to figure out that you're looking at the movie The Jazz Singer and you're not really sure who came up with the idea first or where it was wailed out. But they had 100 people about to make it, and 100 people made it, and then only one version kind of prevailed over them all. It looks like a little of the historic, except the one that prevails is always the Hollywood version. The Hollywood version is then taken as the version wanted, and then that version is passed on by the studios, who already at this point own their own theatrical viewing screens and are showing them in theaters that they own to the people that want to see them. However, yes, there was a rush to stop Birth of the Nation from being shown right away because racial things were happening, like the KKK was coming out of hiding and saying that they were going to go on a roustabout. I don't know what that means. I didn't mean to say it. I know it offended some people, but they were going to go cajoling. How's that word? And the blacks were disturbed, like they didn't want to be represented as slaves ever. They didn't even want that to cross, because you got to realize it was in 1915 when the movie came out. I mean, it wasn't when the Civil War was going on. And that's what we're always forgetting. We're always like, man, the Civil War back then was terrible. And it's like, that's a misnomer because the Civil War was long over, but the civil rights had been a long, swamped, minute point for consideration until like the philosophy of 67 came into picturing that like education was like this dormitory of prison or something, that like education was the panopticon, said Foucault. It was this whole place that you can see these little events happening. Panopticon, doesn't that remind you of Intolerance, where you see the small minute girl and then it zooms out and you see thousands of people dangling from this Babylonian set, giant elephants everywhere and giant people walking on stilts, and this whole thing about where like people are throwing rugs around and everybody's happy and everybody's dancing, and then suddenly it's into the world and everything breaks free. So it's like this beautiful, everything's happening, budding for some reason, and then all of a sudden it just explodes with warfare from when they're commonly taken over, and you can see all of these things in just one Billy Bitzer pullback screenshot that is the most expensive screenshot in film history. And so we always talk about these things. We've talked about these things. We've really looked it over. I mean, we really looked over even the movie America. We were going to look over that, and it's like, I can't tell you whether it became before the important ones or after the important ones, but doesn't it seem like that Orphans of the Storm is really at the last point of Griffith saying, you have to think my films are inexorably historic and beautiful in their account of the melodrama of the history of the world and war and love and peace and equity and us finding each other in the souls of our wreckage and all these other things that you know, writers like the great writers like H.G. Wells and the great writers like Leo Tolstoy, and they all come forth and they're like writing the ultra novel, the mega novel, and that's what Griffith's doing with film. He's making the mega film. There's already the super westerns. It's like the mega film. It's like the bigger film than any of them film is coming with Griffith. And Intolerance and Orphans of the Storm. These are the biggest and none will make bigger, and in some ways that's true. In some ways no one has ever outdid the total blitzkrieg wildness of Birth of a Nation has never been that unhinged before. And the total Goliath gets rocked to the hurricane channel of Intolerance. No one's, even with Cloud Atlas piled on top of Run Lola Run, you still can't figure out how Griffith so melodiously guided us through the intolerance of intolerance. And if you thought all that was just for the sake of it, but it wasn't like a full image of what Griffith wanted to do, that's what's so untragic about his story, is that he actually made the films he wanted to make. Not the tragedy that he didn't go on at the sound era was only because he was making us all feel guilty about drinking. No, it's because he was out of ideas and out of crutch with the cinema, and the cinema had moved on. The sound era had been progressive for him. The sound era was too hard for him to use, even though The Struggle has a great sound edit to it. The sound processes were too much for him to focus on if he was going to make a film like he had made his earlier triumphs. And so he was kind of out of the game by the time America's hitting the lockbox and Battle of the Sexes is coming down the pike, and Lady of the Pavements is kind of one last take on the epic look at the downtrodden in life that are homeless, Norma Talmadge again. And it's this really sad film, and it kind of dwindles sadly on, and as was that a Griffith film gone by. And what are we keeping track of in our daily lives? Do we have the daily argument, these are too racist by today's standards, or the daily argument like, these are too much like the Soviets would have edited them, and we don't want to be like that, because we can criticize everything we have being from the origin of the place we reconcile as, our there's protagonists and there's antagonists. We have our own antagonists where we put them. Sometimes those antagonists may arrive as protagonists in the silent era, and I'm not getting all mixed up on the dark side kind of stuff here. I'm just saying that, like, D.W.Griffith was from a cult of artists that wanted to push the art to the maximum, like the Illuminati of art, that wanted to push it to the life or death situation that it needs to be. And that's what the meaning of cinema for the sake of cinema, Wrecking Crew coming through, D.W.Griffith building the world's biggest set, and it still being the world's biggest set, is incredible. I mean, nobody else can pull that off throughout cinema history. I mean, Griffith really feathers out during the sound era, right? But he goes down in such a bang that, like, everything starts to make sense about why he's not making these epics anymore, and about why he's moving out into these, like, kind of sound films that are going to kind of relay what he needs to say. Nobody ever talks about how in Abraham Lincoln, he's got, like, this whole crew working for him that's African American, and I don't think that blackface was quite the element in Abraham Lincoln, but I don't think it also wasn't hindrance with those same kind of all-black plays like Cabin in the Sky, which we excuse, and Hallelujah, we excuse, as all black casts, but also kind of a gimmick that they were using at the time to sell the musical. And the musical format was different to Griffith because most of the time he didn't have musical scenes. Like we see in Greed, there's a lot of scenes where they're dancing at the carnival and whatnot, and even the ones that are blistered back in by TCM, and we see them dancing at the carnival, the music instruments, early in the film when they're getting married and have all the money. And that's like silent film directed to the musical theater that's not there. It's still silent, but we're accusing them of listening to the music that's being played at the scenario that you're being gestured towards. Whereas Griffith doesn't have a lot of sound movements, which is weird because the Great Train Robbery, the one that kind of started it all, and is really another version of Birth of the Nation, really, that's been going on since the history of film, is that there's a barnyard dance scene, and here we have directing into the directing of music being part of the initial, this must be going on. Now, there is music in the audience, the orchestra, or the latent score put over it on a DVD, or the sound that was going in the theater at the time that was playing the score for the film. And usually when a Great Train Robbery was on, you'd have one of those Rolo pianos that you just kind of roll the index and it would play the piano song, a player piano, or an organ even. They would have these like kind of earlier than pipe organs. They're like not earlier, but like these electric organs that'll start playing at the beginning of around the teens of the silent era. And they can play the parts. So if there is a music part, there's always music going. Dun, 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 dun. If there's a music part, you can kind of break out the extra notes and chords to let it see that you're directing a music part. That's what I call a primitive music sequence, because then when they install sound in this film that Griffith and Louis Armstrong are going around trying to get made, the first sound film or whatever, and everybody's trying to get it made, and then they finally get the jazz singer made, and everybody's like, nobody knows who made that. It was really cool, but and they really do. I just don't have the notes on me right now. It was Al Jolson who was the actor in it instead of Louis Armstrong, and I think it would have been better with a Louis Armstrong type character and been more radical in its politics and more featured now that Within Our Gates is coming back as this great movie and everything. So here's to all those titles that made it through that era, because most of the time films have a way of corrupting and disappearing and ending up in archives, and for not being even played or not played, they shatter into little bits. They're coming from celluloid, from whale blubber. It's like the emulsions that explode, the halides that explode and form the picture on the back of the emulsifiers is where the celluloid takes its print from. And all of that is biodegradable because it's not synthetic, it's generic, it's organic. The film is an organic structure. And we're all there the whole time going, but I thought it was synthetic. I thought you could do this. Was it digitally? I thought you could do this digitally. So now you say we transfer everything to digital, we're still going to lose something. We don't know what we're going to lose because we have the computer monitoring full around, supposedly, right, on everything that looks like it could still be part of the Griffith era and or Griffith filmmaking process. And we like to get into that mode of thinking in this class because then it prepares us to take on the silent era, and the silent era can be a big problem if you don't look at all the ins and outs of where Griffith fit into it. Like, for instance, if he hadn't made the gigantic epics in America of the epic things that later Cecil B. DeMille will be contriving to, and making kind of those epic big, eventually Ben-Hur big monster, like, the thing that you're trying to replace that feels gone is so much bigger than the original that now we've got intolerance because Birth of a Nation didn't work out. So now we've got intolerance, which is even more huge. And then you can see kind of varying dimensions from Broken Blossoms to Orphans on the Storm. And I always find those variants interesting. Like, why is Broken Blossoms not as big of a movie as Orphans of the Storm? Is it because Orphans of the Storm is later? But Intolerance is earlier, and it's the biggest one. It was like, let's get all the big ones out of us before we really get down and get funky. So, it was a good class today. We still have 10 minutes to discuss cinema and Griffith and all these beautiful factors we're putting together, but soon we're going to have to put together kind of a style, an auteur style, and mark it down and say that that's what we believe is the mythology and genre of D.W.Griffith most opt for, and we'd say the romantic melodrama epic, right? That's what he mostly does. That he's done a horror film with Avenging Conscience, well, it's still done melodramatically. So he's done other genres, but really not the comedy so much, but the melodrama. And every film he does is melodrama. That the melodrama is the problem with Birth of a Nation is part of why there are stereotypes there, because melodrama does tend to come from the days of vaudeville, and vaudeville really is impressed upon stereotypes for selling. Not, and one thing we can't forget is when they're selling the mime work. The mime work, of course, is going to be over exaggerated. So now, if they're in blackface and celebrating mime work that's over exaggerated, maybe their intentions weren't to be racist at first. Maybe they were to be like, we're going to make it real big because this is what it's like with black people. My problem is that labeling them as a certain motion as they would make is going to be real problematic later when you find out that African Americans had to have the film banned because it was so disgusting of a look at how they really are, or that it was problematic. Really, the big deal was they brought the Klan out of hiding, and when the Klan got out of hiding, it's like total mess. It was like they didn't know whether to get rid of the film forever, or wait a few years till the Klan didn't have to go to hiding, or see what the direction of the politics would go. And Griffith did try to see a re-release of it right around the end of his career. What a coincidence that the end of his career in 1930 was also around the time he was trying to bring Birth back. He was trying anything to get his cinema career to stay, and he may have put the nail on the coffin with the time that he chunked out his Birth of a Nation in the 1930s, discussing with Fonda, with Walter, or not Peter Fonda, but Walter Houston, about the reconciling Birth of a Nation to the films of the sound era, and that they could make a sound version era if they were interested, that they were making a sound version era, and the whole thing felt to despot. I mean, it just felt to him back in the jail cell, wishing he could govern a film again, but realizing that his communism to him was more important. Now, this is not the story you'll get from American Life, the story I'm giving you. The story I'm giving you is roughly found from the other annals of D.W. Griffith. This is more the rise all the way to Birth, and then the further rise to the struggle, and then the last few years that didn't go so good, even though he found the Holocaust and put it to a stop. Now, we could really go right to that Holocaust story and say, okay, so here comes D.W. Griffith and Louis Armstrong on this plane. All of a sudden, he tells Louis Armstrong to get out of the plane because he's going to crash. So he gets out, he crashes. He crashes, amazingly enough, on Dachau. This is something he was looking for, since Griffith and Chaplin, who worked a ton together, were working on The Great Dictator together. Even after Griffith had been barred from filmmaking, he helped on The Great Dictator. Well, no. But he found Dachau, and they sounded the alarms, and John Ford brought in the Air Force, and they completely bombed out all of those hellish death camps and hellish, Holocaust places that were just killing Jews by the thousands, and reaping hindrance on anybody that was like freaking vengeance on anyone that was Jewish, and they were just demolishing them. And finally Griffith and a few other leaders of the army, and Griffith was still promoted in the army while being a jailbird on the other side. But Griffith having found, and then Louis Armstrong was picked up later too and was amazed by the whole thing. But having found the Holocaust on a mission right towards the end of the war, and then still having time to refuel your jet and go back for the Bomb Berlin mission, that's something that only a U.S. soldier could explain, man. How Griffith was ready to go bomb out Hitler right after he was able to liberate Dachau. And the story's in here, and the story says he gets PTSD. And even sitting in his jail cell, they're like, it's unfair that it's pressed upon him that he has to deal with his PTSD that whole time. And I'm like, well, that story is too big for me, too complicated for me. And here I am, the Griffith chair, probably because I carry the information on with me and I like to give it out. And sometime the following weeks, we're going to try and rely on a style and try to rely on a genre. And we've talked about romantic melodramas. We're going to try and talk about other directors and how they compare to Griffith too, and the usual. But you see now what we're sitting kind of on the edge of is what is the style of Griffith, and it's kind of these broad strokes to create a general empathy for situations of impressive occasion that come forth in visual mastery, sequence after sequence, mounted by outline and pencil and camera, to reveal what it's like to heighten film to an art form, for a classical modern form of American cinema, for the narrative film, black and white, and for all things storytelling. Even in the silent era, we have the epic film romantic melodramas of D.W.Griffith. And I would love to end there and say that we've not spoken enough praise to him, but it's not like I'm one of those teachers that's going to let him necessarily off the hook and just say, well, what he did wrong is automatically not wrong because he's a filmmaker, but instead I'm going to not focus on things that he may have done wrong in his life, that we haven't gotten out of Hollywood Babylon or anywhere else yet. And I'm not so interested in hearsay or knowledge of what he was doing, unless it ends up being he was buying weed for his jazz friends, because he always was. He bought them weed to play jazz music. It's what they wanted to play jazz music for was being paid in weed. And it wasn't like this whole, we can look back to this colonial impact the dealer has had on, these tortured souls. They were all friends. They were buying weed for each other. It wasn't a big deal. They fought in World War I together. And then in World War II. And of course, Griffith brought back up the marijuana thing again. He was like, later in his years, he said, wow, we fought a big war, World War II. We ought to have weed legalized instead of that droopy movie, Reefer Madness, that still keeps playing and everybody takes seriously after joking about it. But it's like, Griffith's mad still that the weed's not legal. He thinks it'll be a better director of community when it is, for the others that can help out and things we can help others with. And I'm absurdly opposed to all of you. And then he goes back to jail, then I'd stay for communism anyway. So it's really a fascinating story all throughout. All of these things lead to fascinating stories and these kind of rituals of Hollywood and these kind of rituals of filmmaking progress and kind of the way that films are shaped and the way films are moved and the way centuries of programming of cinema has been put on the shoulders of this one director who's got to rise out of the silent era, beat them all, and then somehow fall the worst from not having seen forth the future. It's this epic story itself. And that's why it's this big book, and that's why there's big launcher books on Griffith, and why I may be a chair, but I'm only a small piece to the puzzle of this wild chairman of the Directors Guild for so long, and was the D.W.Griffith Award until Kubrick got it. And I just think, well, if one thing Griffith should have known, it was that he really put the eccentricity into director and directing controversial subject matter to stand out as a director over time is kind of one of those good things to do, to stand out as a director, because everybody's talking about you now. I mean, for him to be perceived as a silent director talked about now is almost impossible to even consider, that we're just sitting here talking about an era gone by and now there's sound, so what's the point of silent, and that you can't do anything fun with silent film except move the camera everywhere you want to and then move it some. And you can't always go without sound in a silent film like some Chaplin films have shown. And you can't always have things follow the certain rule book in a silent film. And the fact that Griffith makes these films, like the sound film era, will be directed, with the only exception of the scope is a little vent centered in for the microphones, which are centered in to the frame. But when you can break free with more than one microphone and go in different directions, like the movie Nashville by Robert Altman, where everybody's got their own microphone and it's all being worked, and the instruments have their own microphone. The cast is learning to play the music. The cast is writing the music. And then you mic everything and you kind of go with this soundboard switcheroo of Robert Altman. And you kind of get the sound of the great sound masterpieces that have been done in cinema history, that really, again, Altman's looking at Griffith saying, oh, if this is intolerance, then I want the microphoned version of intolerance, you know. And we're going to capture all the sounds as we go all over the city, all over the town, looking for the right sounds and the right way to hear the sound, and then the sound playing from a previous image to a previous image, being mixed but synced to the production on screen, which is a different process than having an orchestra play along with you, than it being synced to the movie. If it's synced to the movie, that means it's recorded with the movie and is always there. The orchestra is live, so they could have a nuance of being a live sound, and I know some people can hear between a live sound and a recorded sound, and the difference, and that you, if you want to hear it live, that's cool. If you want to hear it recorded, that's totally cool. And we love sound that's been recorded, but when it's been played live, then they've only got the technical mastery up to the point of the exact performance they're playing at that point, you know. And that's where they're getting trouble syncing sound in the early jazz singer. But the syncing of sound by the time of Busby Berkeley is like old hat. It's top hat, but it's old hat. And I can't say that the RKO pictures are really the ones that produce the most Griffith-like imagery later, or like just because it seems like that studio would have taken him, or Warner Brothers because of all, or even Fox because of all of his Western-like movies. We got to remember John Ford was already sneaking around in the background making Three Bad Men and Iron Horse and all that. And John Ford's about to launch after Griffith as the sound film guy. But he's in the silent era at the exact same time, making these go to the trenches movies. And Griffith is like this war zone director in this Murnau. Murnau is what really struck Fox as a really eccentric, huge figure of directing skill. That Fox always wanted to have control, like Murnau had, which is like total control of the movie. Then that's what Fox was after. But we all know Murnau was always talking to Griffith about the do's and don'ts of filmmaking. That they were all in a club and all in a film club is true. And that there is some truth to the meta film club, which is where everybody that's producing film or enacting in film or in film in some way is part of the film club. And it's kind of this access floating around whatever icons or iconography those may militate or mitigate or initiate or produce, those icons and iconography. And we know by ours, we kind of get this picture of Griffith as this never let down captain of the army type, but also this like very let down by the atrocities of inhumanity, but also like very put it in your face what's the atrocities of humanity, to the very victory of being saved of your life at the very last second, which is what we see in Intolerance and the other films that are about movies that are about last-minute rescues. And that's like the difference between an apocalypse, like in Hitchcock, is everybody dies. Like by the time the end of Notorious, it's apocalypse. But by the time of the end of Intolerance, dude's life saved. It's a last-minute rescue. Hey, it's kind of a dramatic feature, and we can use that in melodrama. It's better than staying sad like they do in Broken Blossoms. And anyway, you don't stay sad. You go have some fun. Come back to Masterclass if it's in a week or in a few days. We'll talk even more about this. You'll think we've talked about it a lot now. Just wait. We're going to go offline now and let you kind of think all this in and stew all this in, and we'll see you for the last 5. Make it 4 or 5 classes that we have to teach for the D.W.Griffith Auteur 375 film study for USC, Calarts, and Harvard Coursera.